I think we'll start now.
I saw him last weekend.
We have a dual challenge, both being the last panel and following Ralph Gomery, but rather than compete with him, I think that what we'll do is complement and go in a little bit different direction. What our session is being asked to focus on is policy options and trade-offs, and we're in a way looking at the broader ecosystem in which corporate research occurs. We're going to begin with Steve Merrill talking about increasing and rebalancing the public research portfolios. Then we'll go into some of the external influences on corporate research, like tax policy, antitrust, maybe a little bit on regulation, a little bit on budget. Any remarks that I have, I'll do as Mr. Janley did, and maybe say something briefly at the end of the panel discussion. And so let's go ahead with Steve here.
So the first thing I want to do is a housekeeping detail. I want to thank the Duke and DC staff who are not employees of the center or the law school and have been very gracious in their time and effort to make this a successful event. We can collectively thank them by removing any trash at the end of the meeting so they don't have to stay and clean up after us. I'm going to be taking us back to a question that Eduardo Porter posed at the end of his session. He said simply, what about public sector and nonprofit sector R&D? And there are a couple of well-known facts, particularly about the public sector, which are, first of all, that real federal investment has been falling in real terms and as in relation to the size of the economy. And this is a pretty dramatic example of the fact that as a share of GDP, federal R&D is at the lowest level since data was beginning to be collected in the early 1950s, less than 1%. The other thing that's well known is that and I'm going to be focusing primarily on the composition of the federal and nonprofit portfolios rather than simply belabor the well-known story about the level. And the other well-known fact about federal R&D is that the composition has shifted markedly in favor of the biological and medical sciences and away from physical sciences and engineering over a long period of time, but especially since the late 1980s. This is data from NSF analyzed by the AAAS. What I want to call your attention to particularly is the pink spike, because I'm going to be coming back to that. Now, what's happened in detail to the composition is, as I said, a story of growth in the life sciences relative to the physical sciences and engineering. This is data from NSF, from the Federal Fund Survey of agency spending on R&D, and it is in constant dollars. So early years look a lot bigger than they seem to be at the time. And I want to call your attention particularly to the shares that I've calculated for 1980 versus 2015, which show a 13% increase in the life sciences and a 13% drop in the physical sciences and engineering. My remarks should not be interpreted as my implying that the portfolio, the composition of the portfolio should be static over time, or that there was any one point in time when we got it right. But I think there is not a widespread understanding of how the physical sciences and engineering have fared over the last several decades, particularly since the end of the Cold War. I want to draw your particular attention to some subfields of research, which, and my choice of subfields, there are about 30, I think, in the NSF data, but my choice is not purely arbitrary or my own supposition about what's economically important. I discovered that as part of his enormous survey of R&D managers in the manufacturing sector in the early 90s, Wes Cohen asked questions about what fields of research were important to them. And it turns out that the broadest impact, or potential impact, was in a set of fields, including computer science, medical biology, of course, materials, and metallurgy, and chemistry and electrical engineering. And you can see what happened to biological and medical science. And the other fields, the physical science and engineering fields, are all grouped at the bottom. They have somewhat different trajectories. Computer science started off very modestly in 1980 and has increased in real terms about 8 times over that period. Materials and metallurgy has improved slightly, much less, about 3 times over that period. But electrical engineering and chemistry have actually declined in real terms. So what about the question that Eduardo posed about other funders stepping up to the plate and compensating for some of these changes? And here I've used the NSF higher education R&D data, asked of universities what their other sources of funding, apart from the federal government, are. There are 3 principal sources. The biggest, by far, and growing, is own institutional funding. The second, that's about $16 billion in 2015. The second is nonprofit institutions and including philanthropies, foundations, and so forth. That's about slightly over $4 billion, and the business sector is the smallest. It's only about $4 billion. But you can see from these pie charts that in all of these cases, their portfolios are more heavily weighted to the biological sciences than they are to the physical sciences and engineering. To some limited degree, business and institutional funds are helping out engineering, but very little of it is going to physical sciences. So this is not a new problem or a new challenge. It's been recognized for some period of time, and there have been 2 major efforts to deal with it. The first was initiated, I guess, by the National Academy's report called Gathering Storm, which called for a doubling of physical science funding over a 7 to 10-year period. That garnered support from the Bush administration and then the congressional authorizers, and subsequently the Obama administration, but it's largely failed to materialize because all of that support apparently did not impress appropriators very much. A second attempt to deal with this, and a broader range of scientific and engineering opportunities were these set of initiatives out of the White House, honchoed by the Office of Science and Technology Policy, which covered a wide range of fields, including the medical sciences, over a period of time. There are two slides that show these. They accelerated after the failure to double the physical science and engineering budgets of three agencies that were targeted: NSF, NIST, and the National Science Center, or NSF, NIST, and the Department of Energy. So there were several in the last few years. The ones that are more physical science oriented are denoted in red. One thing I'd call your attention to are that there are institutional reasons in both Congress and the administration why physical sciences and engineering don't get the attention they perhaps deserve, or it's difficult to mount attempts to correct or rebalance the federal portfolio. On the congressional side, it's the fact that there are at least three appropriations subcommittees involved in funding DOD, DOE, NSF, and NIST, the four principal agencies. And on the administration side, it's the dispersion of responsibility for these fields across those agencies and more, making it difficult to implement and initiate and implement some of these initiatives. It's not at all clear. I've seen no evaluation of the results of these efforts. They extended well beyond research to activities like technology transfer, so they're not all research funding initiatives. And it's very likely that in order to gain support from the White House, a lot of activities that were ongoing were reclassed as serving these initiatives in order to garner White House support. So that's a pretty pessimistic picture. I don't think anyone in the room, and certainly my employers, would suggest that taking 18% out of the National Institutes of Health budget is a good way of rebalancing the federal portfolio. The pattern has been that increasing investment in these areas has largely accompanied other national needs. In the first place, defense. In the case of the pink spike in the graph, the recovery effort. So we should look to what the next set of initiatives is going to be to sort of evaluate whether they present an opportunity. So Jim suggested that the infrastructure proposal that's forthcoming is a way of addressing possibly some needs in materials and electrical engineering. There may be opportunities in the considerable ramp up of the defense budget. We certainly don't want another financial crisis, which would, in any event, unlikely to produce good results for research. So there are not many opportunities, but there may be a couple.
Yep, go ahead, Eric.
All right. Hi, I'm Eric Toder. I'm not a tech guy, but hopefully I can master this technology. So I'm going to give some very high-level remarks about the budget and tax policy and corporate tax reform issues and try to draw at least some relevance to what you're talking about today. So the first, starting at really 30,000 feet, these are charted as a budget projections of the Congressional Budget Office for the next 10 years. What you see is a rising deficit. That's the difference between the red line and the blue line. Revenues are about flat in their projections, and spending are rising. So the result of that, which is the top line, is the increase in the ratio of the national debt to GDP, which is slightly under 80% now at a pretty historically high level and is slated to rise to about 90% over the next decade. They've just put out a long-term projection which shows things are getting much worse after that. What's driving the spending line is really the so-called entitlements, mainly programs for seniors, Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid. So those are the big three drivers of health and retirement are the drivers of those lines. However, given just that the second shows that we don't know exactly what tax legislation is going to come out of Congress, but the two pieces of information we have are the House GOP blueprint, which was announced last summer, and the outline of Donald Trump's tax plan. This was that he announced in the campaign. And these are just the 10-year revenue losses as estimated by the Tax Policy Center. For the first 10 years, about $3 trillion for the House Republican blueprint, about $6 trillion for the Trump plan. The blueprint gets a little bit better. It goes down to $2 billion because some of the transition effects of shifting to a cash flow tax end up going away, and revenues recover a bit. But the Trump plan gets even worse over the next decade. So we're faced with both a big appetite for tax cuts among the ruling parties and a growing budget problem even without those tax cuts. So that's the position we're in now. I don't need to say about all the unmet needs for infrastructure and crumbling bridges and all the rest of that. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about two aspects of tax policy. One kind of the narrow, and one is the broader. So the more narrow is what is the tax system doing for R&D, and that is shown. You can get a rough idea from the tax expenditure publications that are produced by the Joint Committee and the Treasury. They don't turn out to get the same numbers. I can give some theories about it later, but for now I'll just say what they are. For the next 5 years, about $120 billion, according to the Treasury, and about $80 billion of tax expenditures, according to the Joint Committee. The big ones in there, and somehow or other, the two biggest ones don't show up on the legend, but the biggest ones are the research credit, the incremental credit. That's the lower dark blue line. And the orange one is the expensing, that is the deductibility of research expenditures, which is viewed as a tax benefit because the normal treatment would be to capitalize investments. The light blue is the orphan drug credit. So those are the big ones. I'm not going to say a lot about the tax expenditures. The questions are, do they induce firms to conduct more research? Do they help research-intensive firms expand? Those are two channels through which they could increase research. And the third more important thing is, does this new induced research generate external benefits? With respect to the first two questions, there's been a bunch of research econometric studies on that. Like many of these studies, they're all over the map, but almost all of them show they do induce more research. The question is whether the price elasticity is greater than 1. That is sort of a measure of budget efficiency. That is, does an additional dollar of budget outlays generate more than $1 of induced research or less than $1? And I think the answer is probably a little less, but there are studies on both sides of that line. The other question is whether that generates, I think everyone agrees that private research generates social benefits that are in excess of the private benefits by the information they create. But whether this induced research is well targeted to do that is another open question. I want to talk a little more about the broader issues of our corporate system, which is everybody says is broken. Of course, we have a high corporate rate, but the main issue is how we tax multinationals. And to put it this way, some people are worried that we're putting U.S. companies at a disadvantage and say we should have a territorial tax where we don't follow other countries and don't tax foreign source income of our multinationals. And others are saying, no, we should do something, we should go in the other direction because our system encourages companies to invest overseas if you don't tax foreign income. So we should go in the other way and tax foreign income more heavily. That's kind of a stale debate. I think you're caught between two problems. But it's even worse today because both those concepts of source and residence don't mean a lot. Source, the question really was kind of meaningful when we knew it was coming from factories and equipment. But what's the source of income when it's coming from IP, which can be used anywhere in the world, deployed anywhere? That's a very hard thing to nail down, and companies have been very skillful at shifting their IT profits to low-tax jurisdictions where there's not much economic activity going on. The other issue is what's the tax on a worldwide basis? Well, the problem is how do you determine what's a U.S. resident company? We have a definition. It's companies that are chartered in the U.S. But since multinationals now have production all over the world, shareholders all over the world, employees all over the world, and customers all over the world, the question of what is really economically a U.S. resident as opposed to a German or a Japanese resident company is really something that is less and less meaningful. And when something is less and less meaningful, people try to move around their definitions around. So we see inversions where U.S. companies try to redefine themselves as foreign-based. So what are the solutions to our problems? Well, the general baseline things are, well, we'll reduce the rates and broaden the tax base. That's what we did in 1986. That's a nice idea in theory. The problem is there really aren't that many good tax preferences to get rid of. Most of them are things like the R&E credit that people like, or things like accelerated depreciation, which encourages domestic manufacturing. And anyway, the revenue gain is mostly timing, and the long-run gain is a lot smaller than the short-run gain. So you don't really get that much from the first method. The other thing, which is good but also minimum, is to say, well, we want to have some preference for foreign source income, but the way we do it now is a stupid way. We allow the income to be exempt until it's repatriated, and then we put a high tax on it when it comes back. That's led companies to accrue a lot of profits overseas. And maybe it would be smarter if we didn't tax it when it came back, but taxed it at a low rate when it accrued, and then put a lump sum tax, small lump sum tax on the existing assets. So that's the basis of a lot of reform. Those are positive reforms, but don't solve the basic issue of dealing with a source and residence. So the more fundamental issues, and here I'll give a shout out, although I think it's very poorly designed in many ways, to the House GOP plan to shift to a destination-based tax by exempting exports and eliminating deduction from imports. What they're really doing is saying that the corporate tax will be based not on the charter of the corporation, not on where the corporation says its income is, but on where the sales are. And that's a much easier tax base to implement. So that would be a very interesting reform if that could be done. Other approaches, lower the corporate rate, increase the tax on shareholders. There are various options that would do that. Hasn't gained too much traction. That happens to be one of my favorite approaches. And a third one, which Professor Michael Gratz has said, is really lower corporate income and individual income taxes and rely a lot more on a value-added tax, which again doesn't have these distortions of affecting where corporates. So what are the issues in how this affects research? One, how you treat R&D versus other investments. The current system is very favorable to R&D because it's expensed and gets a credit. If you do some of these reforms with expensing, you'd actually reduce the preference for R&D. So that would, at least from a targeted point of view, be be less advantageous. Incentives for companies to, if you improve the incentives for companies to be U.S. resident, that may be good for R&D because to the extent that U.S. resident companies are more likely to be companies that have their headquarters and do their research here. Not an absolute thing. U.S. resident companies can also do research overseas, but that's one channel. The other is whether there's more investment. Again, that may be more favorable. So the broader issues may be actually more important than the narrowly targeted incentives. And with that, I will stop.
Wasn't sure what the order was.
You're next.
I don't have any slides, so don't look at the screens. One of the things I've been asked to talk about, along with Michael Katz, is what the effect of antitrust enforcement might be on inducing or presenting an impediment or disincentive to corporate R&D. And I'm going to broaden the discussion just a little bit at the end to include federal regulation. I think the underlying theory is that, and Wesley Cohen did a lot of work on this back in the 1990s, some very interesting research. But is there a link between firm size and the incentive and ability to undertake research and development? And the theoretical development really goes back to Joseph Schumpeter, who's an economist here in the United States, one-time finance minister of Austria prior to World War II. And Schumpeter had some very interesting ideas about large firms that would accumulate a lot of capital and use the margins that they generated to invest in R&D and create cycles of creative destruction. So you'd have firms getting large, earning large profit margins, having the resources to invest, and then ultimately over time getting replaced by the next firm that sort of chased them down and replaced their technology. So Schumpeter found that there was a link between firm size and profit margins, and a positive link, and research and development. That's been very contested over time. Economists talk a lot about the Arrow-Schumpeter debate. The late economist Kenneth Arrow had a different view. Ken was very much of the view that competitive markets would create a greater inducement, even if large capital accumulations and market shares would create better ability to invest in R&D. And Sir John Hicks, British economist, used to say that, greatest of monopoly profits, greatest benefit of being a monopolist is the enjoyment of a quiet life. Why would you make the effort with all of these profits and this market share to invest? So there's been, I think, a long-running question about whether large firms and market power are good for innovation or not. Well, this matters very much if you're trying to design antitrust policy, because one of the justifications for mergers is often that by merging, firms will assemble complementary assets, increase some market power, and be better able to invest in innovation going forward. And that kind of argument comes forward as an efficiency or a benefit of mergers quite often. If you subscribe to the Schumpeterian view of competition, you're not terribly afraid of temporary monopolies or short-term accumulations of market power, because you think that will be good for innovation, and by the way, some new innovator will come out of the woodwork, chase that dominant firm down, and replace them over time. If you think competition is good for innovation, you'd like to have